Hello, welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, part of the Aerospace Corporation. This is the next installment of our six-part series, Going Faster. A lot of discussion on how to accelerate government space and commercial space coming together to serve life on Earth. We've talked about gathering open intelligence for national security, more responsive launch capabilities, scaling up nuclear propulsion and power for the Moon and Mars, and the evolution of defense product companies with government as the customer. Today, we are bringing you a great conversation featuring two leaders from powerhouse trade associations in the space industry: the Satellite Industry Association, or SIA, and the Commercial Space Federation, or CSF, Mr. Tom Stroup and David Cavossa. Under Mr. Stroup, SIA focuses on satellite industry and the variety of services around that, from ground to launch to operations. Meanwhile, under Mr. Cavossa, CSF more broadly spans across the space economy, adding sectors like exploration, supply chain, analytics, cislunar, and more. So what are member companies from CSF and SIA thinking in terms of the recent White House executive order that was released in August 2025 that was meant to enable greater competition of the US space industry? Speakers will also discuss TRACS, or the Traffic Coordination System for Space, that aims to provide basic SSA, space situational awareness, to civil and private operators, and it tells them when to watch out for each other. We will also ask about the proposed European Union Space Act and how that might affect American businesses and what their members are watching. Then, as the number of players and the number of spacecraft increases, sharing radio frequency spectrum for communications, data, it's a growing problem. In this case, you can only cut the slices so thin before interference becomes an issue. So guests will talk about something called EPFD, the equivalent power flux density. No, it's not a sci-fi movie. It's a measure of interference to higher geostationary spacecraft from lower orbiting ones, and how they can share the resource and coexist. And what about debris? There's always a question there, especially for continuous operations in LEO. So let's go to Audrey Allison. She is Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. She herself is a space lawyer, and she's a previous consultant for Department of Defense and delegate to the United Nations ITU, or International Telecommunications Union. All right, over to Audrey.
Thank you, Colleen, and welcome everyone to this edition of the Space Policy Show. Now that we are past the first 6 months of the new administration in Washington, D.C., we thought it was high time to talk with some of the leaders of the preeminent U.S. commercial space industry associations to get a readout on how their members are faring under this new administration so far. So we are very pleased today to have Tom Stroup from SIA and Dave Cavossa from the Commercial Space Federation to speak with us about this. And we're not only talking about executive orders and things happening, at the highest levels of our government, but we'll also talk about the Federal Communications Commission activities. We have a new chairman, Brendan Carr, who is a very seasoned veteran at the FCC and has hit the ground running in the regulatory area for space and other areas as well. And we'll also reflect on some of the international activities that are going on. So Tom and Dave, welcome so much. Let me just mention, Tom has been on the Space Policy Show before, and we welcome you back, Tom. And Tom has been over 10 years. He has been leading the Satellite Industry Association, SIA. So thank you very much for coming back. And Dave, I believe this is your first visit on the show. Dave has been in your new role for about a year now, I believe, at CSF, the Commercial Space Federation. But Dave also used to be at SIA many jobs ago for him, way back in the earlier part of the century. So it's great to see you back in Washington again, doing work on behalf of the industry. And so I think it's going to be a good discussion. And so let's just dive straight in. Are you ready, gentlemen?
Absolutely. And I enjoy the opportunity to join you again, Audrey.
Okay, so I didn't read out a laundry list of all the various changes and proposals that we've seen over the last few months. But if you could just take a few moments to talk about the top one or two issues that your associations are most focused on at this time, it'd be a great way to get the discussion started. So let's start off with you, Tom.
Great. Well, I think that the two primary areas that I'd like to highlight are spectrum and licensing. And of course, spectrum is the lifeblood of our industry. This is an issue on which we've been working for a number of years. And I think everybody who's been involved in SIA has played a part in highlighting the importance of spectrum to the industry. And we've done things like compile a spectrum needs report, and our capacity study and our state of the satellite industry report highlights how we're using it. But we're especially pleased with the spectrum abundance proceeding at the FCC, where they're looking at making 3 bands available to the industry, and really greatly increasing the amount of spectrum that's available to the industry. So that's one of the ones that we're very focused on. And again, it's been part of a long-term effort. As I mentioned, the other one is licensing. And again, when I got together with the new head of the Space Bureau, Jay Schwartz, before he started, I told him the thing I hear about most frequently from our members is the speed of processing of applications. And, the creation of the Space Bureau was a great start. The additional resources that have been dedicated, and Jay and his team have done a wonderful job of addressing some of the backlog. But the streamlining proceeding at the FCC, again, this is part of a continuous effort. SIA has filed various recommendations as to how the licensing process can be streamlined, but we're very pleased with many of the changes that have been made. I think that this will greatly expedite the licensing and the time our members are waiting to get their licenses.
Well, that's great. So Dave, what is CSF up to these days?
Yeah, I think Audrey, the big one just came out 2 weeks ago. The Trump executive order around competitiveness in the commercial space industry. That executive order couldn't have been any better if we had written it ourselves. I mean, it was ticking off and attacking a lot of the major issues that the commercial space industry has been looking at for years. The first Trump administration tackled some of those things with some national space policy directives. And then, within 6 months of coming in, the new Trump administration has really taken it to the next level, trying to promote competitiveness for launch and spaceports and sort of new mission ideas that are being launched every day right now and businesses that are being launched. So, the two main themes within that executive order were what we call Part 450, but really launch licensing, commercial launch licensing regulations. That has been troubling issue for the launch industry for the last 5 or 6 years. And the Trump administration is now saying, hey, we need to take another look at that and reform, or amend Part 450. So there's a lot of good work going on there.
And just for our viewers, that those are under the Federal Aviation Administration, right?
Under FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, which is part, of course, of the Department of Transportation. And then the second issue is what we call mission authorization, that was addressed in the executive order, granting the Department of Commerce, specifically the Office of Space Commerce within the department, officially granting them the authority to go forth and set up a mission authorization licensing regime. So those are two of the things that are sort of jump right out. There's more in that executive order that we can talk about if we have time, but those are two things that CSF and our member companies cared greatly about.
So were there any areas of particular concern that you've seen? I hear really positive things. I'm really glad to hear that. But are you approaching the agencies with any of these new proposals of particular concern to your members?
So things beyond what we just talked about?
Yeah, or a subset of what we just talked about.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Tom. I mean, there are two more that have come to the forefront. One that I'll have to admit I'm not an expert on, but I'm trying to get smarter on quickly, which is sort of the interagency coordination and approval process for when satellite operators and space companies are trying to make use of federal spectrum and coordinating with the federal spectrum managers at the agencies throughout the government. So that's becoming a hotter topic, and we're starting to tackle that with the help of the FCC and with the Federal Communications Commission, obviously, and NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, also within the Department of Commerce. So that's a big one. I'm sure Tom has probably been tackling that as well. And then the other one, not so much regulatory, but on the fringes of a regulatory issue, which is the TRACS program. And I won't try to remember what TRACS stands for, so we're gonna have to go with that acronym as is, but the basically the Space Situational Awareness or Space Traffic Management program that Commerce has been running for the last several years. The funding for that program is in question right now. And we're doing everything we can to get people to understand how important that air traffic control equivalent is in space, and that we need to keep that moving forward. So those are probably the two biggest things I'm worried about right now.
Yeah, and Tom, SIA contributed to that as well, didn't they?
Yeah, and both of those are important issues, and I'm glad Dave mentioned them because the whole coordination for the shared use of commercial and government spectrum is an issue. Just in some ways, it's how well it is coordinated, and this is something that we've raised with the FCC, NTIA, NASA, just trying to make sure that we can help smooth the process, streamline it. We had a roundtable discussion with the FCC and NTIA about a month ago, just really trying to give them ideas and get reactions because some of our ideas will work well, and others, they said, identified why it wouldn't be able to work, and they also responded with maybe if we did things a different way, whatever. So that's been very helpful, but it's an ongoing issue, and in some ways it's a resource issue, just making sure that when an application is submitted to the FCC and forwarded to NTIA, that there's someone that is able to take a look at it to address it. The other issue that Dave mentioned, I think, is also very important is TRACS. I mean, and certainly the space industry came behind the effort to make sure that it was funded. As part of the executive order, the Office of Space Commerce is being elevated. I think that's going to turn out to be very positive for the industry, but there are some procedural steps that will probably need to be addressed, and making sure that the momentum that is created by the executive order carries forward with the elevation, and making sure that it doesn't have an impact on the TRACS program is going to be very important to the industry.
Indeed, indeed. Well, great. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, just this TRACS program, it's a head scratcher for me because, Tom, I don't know about you, but we've been trying to find somebody in the Trump administration, in the federal government, that doesn't like TRACS. We keep getting, oh, well, there's somebody that's trying to cut back on it, but we can't find that human being or that office or that individual. I'm hearing rumors of rationales for why it needs to change or go back to the Department of Defense. The DoD has come back and said very strongly, we do not want this back. We do not want this responsibility. This is much better handled by Commerce. And for $50 million a year to have full, space traffic management capability, at the same time, the Trump administration is putting $12.5 billion into air traffic control, because we recognize how important it is to have air traffic control. For $50 million a year, we have all space traffic control, right? Or space traffic management, at least. So that's just, it's a head scratcher, and we're spending a lot of energy on that one right now.
Yeah, Dave, it's fascinating because usually you could identify a person who was the source of the cut, and agree. DoD has not expressed an interest in taking on the role, retaking the role, I guess would be the best way to put it. And it's really frustrating to not be able to go to a person and say, okay, what is the rationale for this? Let us talk about our perspective on it. So that may be one of the reasons why we were successful in our congressional efforts, our being the space industry as a whole, to be able to get the funding restored. But again, it's the battle's not over yet.
For the benefit of our audience members who may be new to this issue, Dave, can you elaborate a little bit more about the history of why we have a track system and going back to the first Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. I mean, it was the first Trump administration that put out National Space Policy Directive 3 or NSPD 3, which moved tracks, or the equivalent at the time, which was called spacetrack.org, from the Department of Defense Space Force at the time over to Commerce, because of the recognition of the fact that we're going from a couple thousand objects in orbit a few years ago to tens of thousands of objects, and eventually even potentially higher than that, and that space traffic management and space situational awareness is going to be key. So it was the first Trump administration that moved it, and just to see it cut, we just don't think that the left hand and the right hand are talking to each other here, and we're trying to make sure that everybody's aware of where this came from and why it's still important today, just like it was 6 years ago when it was first moved.
Yeah, and if I could add, this is, a good example of how long it can take in Washington to establish policy. But shortly after I joined SIA, as you mentioned, Audrey, a little over 10 years ago, one of the first meetings I attended was with various stakeholders, at which some representatives of the Defense Department indicated that they sought to give up the conjunction warning activity that they were doing, and there was a good reason why they wanted to protect their assets. But even at that time, they noted that 90% of the conjunction warnings they were providing were for the commercial industry. And so we spent a lot of time talking about who should take on that role, whether it should be the FAA, whether it should be the Department of Commerce or whatever. And as Dave mentioned, fortunately, with the SPD 3 coming out of the Trump administration, it was identified the Office of Space Commerce would take on that role. And again, going back to the point that we had discussed before, it's fascinating that given their support for this program, that there would be any effort to cut back on it. So it's really interesting. And again, I think why the industry is so supportive of continuing the funding for the TRACS program, because it took such a long time to get to where we are.
Well, one further question, most of the industry, as represented by you all and other associations as well, have chimed in on this issue, but have some industry segments developed that might want to take over this as a private function that you're aware of?
Well,
I'm not aware of any. I think that, the TRACS program does include the utilization of commercial resources. So I'm not aware of any other organization that has been advocating for cutting back on the funding for the TRACS program. Dave, I don't know, maybe you've heard of it.
I mean, I think there are 20 or more commercial SSA providers out there between the United States and then overseas providing similar services. But I don't think, I'm not sure, and I want to be careful in what I say here. I represent a couple of SSA providers. I'm not sure any one of them is ready to take it over full cloth tomorrow. They need a government entity in the middle to sort of structure it and create a clearinghouse and pay for the service to sort of supplement the commercial market interest here.
And then also to interact with other regional and global bodies as well. Yeah. Well, fascinating discussion so far, but let's pull back on the lens a little bit and take a look about developments happening in Europe. We recently saw the draft that has been prepared of the European Union's Space Act. And I know your associations have, and many others have been quite engaged with reviewing its voluminous provisions and speaking with our government as to what the U.S. reaction should be to this draft plan. Is this a good thing for the U.S. industry? So what do your members think? Maybe Dave, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to see the European Union coming together and trying to come up with one sort of standard, one approach, rather than multiple different approaches country by country. So that, that's always going to be a positive. But the devil will be in the details, and the early details on the EU Space Act are quite alarming, and we see a lot of regulatory overreach. We see a lot of requirements and processes they want to put in place that we're not sure are actually easily implementable by commercial space operators. And there seems to be a little bit of a preference for the EU space providers and satellite and comms providers in the EU Space Act that would provide a disadvantage to non-EU space players. And then there's even a question about what is an EU space player and what is not an EU space player by definition. So, I think generally in the US, there's a feeling that we are not anti-competitive when it comes to our regulatory processes. I mean, when you look at some of the largest satellite operators, they're non-US here in the United States today. So EU, we feel like, is heading in the wrong direction here. And I think they've probably developed something that the entire US space industry is going to get together on and be in one voice, is my guess.
And Tom, how is SIA reacting?
Yeah, so we provided comments to the Commerce and State Departments about a month ago, and there's some things in the draft that we like as it relates to space sustainability, but there are a lot of concerns consistent with what David mentioned. I mean, there are questions such as if someone is selling data that is gathered from a satellite, are you all of a sudden under jurisdiction? Is that company under the jurisdiction of the EU Space Act? And so there are a lot of questions like that. We provided some recommendations as to the technical aspects of what is included. But there is a potential for much greater regulatory burden for our members. So I think that is probably the overriding concern. And again, we've provided input to the U.S. government. I'm sure our members are going to be providing input directly into the EU as well. But we're certainly hopeful that representatives of the U.S. government will convey the concerns, not just from SIA, but from the rest of the space industry.
Yeah, so what are the next steps on this and the timing, do you understand?
So that's a good question. I think that, the planned implementation is 2030. And I suspect that I'm not an expert on EU process.
None of us are.
So I don't know whether they move any faster than policymakers do in some instances here. But our goal, as requested by the Commerce and State Departments, was to provide them with input about a month ago, and so we've done that, and we're hopeful that they're aggregating all of the comments and conveying that to their EU counterparts.
Well, looking at, just for a few moments, the global scale of course, space policy and space law, everything's impacted globally. We have looming ahead of us a World Radio Communication Conference coming up in 2027. The really excellent news is this is really a space conference. 80% of the agenda items are about space. Mostly, it's about capturing innovations and it's positive. There are a couple of items that are more bent on concerns, equitable access to the orbits in light of these large constellations that are entering service. Concerns about appropriate national authorization of services. So preparations are well underway in the US and all around the world. Now, Tom, I observed that SIA has recently joined the FCC's advisory committee to prepare for the World Radio Conference. And I'm just wondering, how are you or your members feeling about how the US preparations are going for WRC? If you have any top hopes or concerns the other way, what are the big issues?
Yeah, well, certainly, as you noted, this is the space conference, and over 85% of the issues do relate to the space industry. And so we provided input to the FCC about a year ago, a little over a year ago, with specific recommendations on the WAC process, and certainly seeking to make sure that those are advocated. Of course, many of the issues relate to sharing. So one of our primary goals is ensuring the protection of the spectrum that is made available to the satellite industry, as well as ensuring that we have access to additional bands going forward. But, there are a lot of interesting aspects to this. Of course, one is the appointment of the lead for the U.S. delegation. Making sure that is done as soon as possible is, of course, important. The location of the WRC, of course, is of concern. Many of our members have expressed concern about their ability to be able to operate efficiently within China. I mean, and so that is a concern.
Shanghai, China is what has been selected.
Yes,
It's right
good
now
point.
under
I should
a
have clarified
consultation
that, right?
process.
Yeah. And So there are a number of things that we can do, and of course, participation in the preparation, the comments that we submitted. But there are also things that we've been working on, such as the support of the ITU Secretary General's candidacy. I mean, as someone who understands the space industry. And making sure that their efforts are led by someone with the understanding that Doreen Bogdan-Martin has. So there are a lot of different things that we're doing, as you noted, ranging from participation in the committee, to submitting comments, to some of the bigger picture issues that we're addressing.
Excellent, excellent. And by the way, Doreen Bogdan-Martin was a former guest on the Space Policy Show. So Dave, what about CSF?
We're just sort of starting to dive into that conversation here within CSF. Traditionally, CSF used to be called the Commercial Space Flight Federation. And when I came on board a year and a half ago, was sort of seen as a sort of launch and, moon to Mars focused organization. So we've been expanding that presence to the point now where we have a substantial representation of non-geo satellite operators, the Starlinks and Amazon Kuipers of the world, among others. So CSF starting to pull together a position and some thoughts on this. I think, EPFD obviously will be a big issue going into the WRC.
Yes. Might you want to explain what EPFD is very briefly?
I think I know the acronym, but I could not tell you what it means. I'm not the right one to explain EPFD limits.
Okay, and now I have equivalent power, isotropically something power, but in short, it's how they define
flux density.
Thank you. Power limits for sharing between geostationary and non-geostationary systems. It is a very important issue. It's not actually on the agenda, but I'm sure it will be discussed at the conference as a potential future agenda item. To allow more perhaps efficient use of the spectrum and the orbits, more services, more satellites, which might give pause to other concerns. But the ITU is about bringing more services and more efficient and effective use, but you have to guarantee that the incumbents get protected by any new limits. So it's been a highly controversial issue.
Well, I think I'll just add one final comment there, which is that as we launch all of these satellites into low Earth orbit, more constellations, tens of thousands of satellites trying to take on more of the communications load of the population of Earth, right? And for the expanded needs for data centers and direct to device mobile, what we look around and say the US government and our regulatory process tends to favor terrestrial wireless first and foremost over satellite, whereas China and other countries don't tend to favor terrestrial wireless over satellite. So while you have other countries moving forward into international bodies like the ITU and WRC with the full support for their satellite initiatives, the US government tends to be a little bit more split in those areas. And we feel like that the US non-geo operators are coming in at a disadvantage to their competitors in China and beyond. So that's an issue that we're going to continue to push for.
Yeah, and Audrey, for your audience, it may be helpful to just have an understanding about this issue, because it's a matter of sharing spectrum between geo and non-geo providers, and you can imagine the complexity when rules were initially established, when there were at the time really only one company that was providing service via non-geo system, and now you've got a number with a tremendously increased number of satellites. Just the complexity of trying to ensure that they're not interfering with each other really does create a complex issue. And it is controversial, as you can well imagine. The geo providers have a different perspective than the non-geo providers.
Yeah. Yeah, and we should mention there is a live FCC rulemaking proceeding on this very issue. So you watch the news, because I think the comment rounds have been completed in that proceeding. So it'll be interesting to see where it comes out. But we seem to have found some distinct flavors between your associations on some of these issues. We've seen a lot of broad agreement as well. So it's an interesting thing, and it's a very interesting topic to hear the debates at the last World Radio Conference in 2023, because geostationary services are still very important to the rest of the world, but those limits were adopted 20 years ago. So it shouldn't hurt to study them, but I appreciate the concern. But it's certainly something to watch as we prepare for 2027. Well, unless we have other thoughts on that, turning from all these discrete issues, we thought we might turn to, in our remaining, maybe just one last question, a more general concern was, so what are some underappreciated pain points for U.S. space and satellite companies right now, beyond these licensing or spectrum or other issues we may have discussed? Is there something we're leaving out in our discussion? Whoever thinks of something first, just jump in.
Yeah, I think that it really depends upon the sector of the industry, and I won't necessarily say some of these are underappreciated, because they can be front and center beyond the regulatory issues that we've been talking about. But just going through some of the different sectors of the industry, I mean, by revenue, the largest continues to be video distribution, and one of the pain points that they're experiencing is a transition away from a transition to over-the-top services. And so, those companies within the satellite industry, like those within the terrestrial industry, the cable industry, are seeing a decline in terms of the number of subscribers. Within the broadband sector of the industry, I think competition. I mean, there's way more competition with the new entrants into the industry, and that's creating issues for those companies, leading to some of the consolidation that we've seen within the industry. I think that another sector that's been affected, the transponder leasing industry, which used to be much bigger than it is today, the overcapacity has led to a decline in pricing, which of course has had an impact on those companies, again, leading to some of the consolidation that we've seen. And then within manufacturing, I think that we've seen, just a change in demand. We've gone from bespoke satellites primarily for geostationary orbits to utilization of mass manufacturing, smaller satellites. And that really has impacted the manufacturing sector of the industry in many ways in a positive respect, but also many of the companies that are deploying their constellations are vertically integrated. So that's creating less demand. And if you were to, for those of you who have seen our State of the Satellite Industry report, you see that manufacturing revenues are really generated by some of the high value satellites that are manufactured for the government. And so this transition to smaller satellites is definitely having an impact on that portion of the industry. So again, I'm not sure that I would call them underappreciated, but certainly very important to the health of the industry.
Thank you. Dave, any thoughts?
Yeah, look, I could talk for 45 minutes about that question alone, to tell you the truth, because I look at my whiteboard off screen about all of the things that we need to be tackling as an industry. It's getting longer and longer, not shorter. Export controls are still an issue for all of us across the board. It's been for 20 years, and I'm sure it'll be for another 20 years. The other one that is raising its head more and more every day is China. We've already alluded to China a little bit here, but they are moving steadily forward to overtake the United States in space. And listen, there are national security concerns there as well, but they're very focused on economic and owning space, much the way the United States was the space leader early on in the 60s and 70s through recently, and much in the way that we became the leader in the internet, and much the way that we're becoming the leader when it comes to AI. The Chinese government about 10 years ago decided that they wanted to be the leader in space. And they have been steadily making steps and investing and moving forward and creating a quasi-commercial space industry, and creating a space station, Tiangong, that will compete with the International Space Station for science, and creating a moon to Mars equivalent architecture, and investing heavily in several launch companies. So I talk about that for two reasons. One is because CSF's about to launch our first ever China report that will come out in 2 weeks. So it's a little bit of a plug for our China report called Redshift. So you'll all see that here very soon. But because it plays into the president's executive order from a few weeks ago. It plays into spectrum warehousing. It plays into all of the decisions that the FCC is making, at the Office of Space Commerce is going to make around mission authorization, which is, does the United States want to maintain its leadership role in space? Does it want to have the strongest commercial space industry going forward? Or are we okay with letting environmental concerns and regulatory concerns slow down US companies to the point where eventually the Chinese will just pass us? So that's a big issue, and it's about to become much more, or gain much more attention, I think, here in the coming months and years.
Well,
Yeah,
look forward
and
to.
I'd add, I think that those two issues actually are interrelated. I mean, the restrictions on export, especially for the remote sensing sector of the industry, where many of the services that are being provided didn't exist 10 years ago, or a little over 10 years ago when we went through ITAR reform. And the restrictions that have been placed on them has certainly had an impact on their ability to sell throughout the world. And of course, we're very concerned about the impact of competition from China for the various reasons that Dave mentioned. And we want to make sure that we don't experience the same thing that happened within the terrestrial wireless industry with Huawei. The ability to be able to undercut pricing because it's being subsidized by the Chinese government, when most of the systems that are being built and deployed are global systems. I mean, we're going to be in competition with them increasingly, and realizing that they may have a government subsidy that makes it very hard to compete in some of the countries that our members are seeking to provide services. So those are very important, and as Ed mentioned, interrelated issues.
Very good. One thing neither of you has brought up, which surprised me, was orbital debris and the rules on orbital debris. Is that still an issue in your association? I know the SIA has been very active on at least the FCC's rules in the past.
Yeah, and I think that ties in with space sustainability and the TRACS program, because it all starts with knowledge of objects in space, whether they're operational satellites or whether they're debris. And again, I just think that it highlights the importance of the TRACS program, and for us all to understand the objects that are there so that we can avoid them.
I think all of our companies have a dramatic incentive to be responsible space actors. Otherwise, they'll lose the use of those orbits and frequencies in the future for themselves and for their businesses. I think we're in the early days here, and number one is, as Tom said, we've got to get a grasp on what's up there, and how to track and how to work on conjunctions, and a lot of the companies are doing their own work here and trying to be responsible space actors. And I think once we have a common operating picture here on where the problems are or where the problems will be, I think then it'll be a lot easier to start putting some guidelines and regulations in place. I'm not sure we're there yet, but we're probably not far off, Audrey.
Thank you for that. Well, this has just been a tremendous conversation. I appreciate you guys devoting the time and explaining to us the views of industry on these evolving topics. I did want to give you each an opportunity if there's any final closing thoughts you want to leave us with today. Tom?
I will close by saying thank you again for the opportunity. Dave, wonderful to share the program with you. Look forward to continuing to work together, because as Audrey noted, we have a commonality of interest, not only in terms of membership, but policy positions, and look forward to continuing to work together.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think there's a 3 or 4 or 5 handful of issues that the entire industry is aligned on, and that's a powerful way to go to the Hill and go to the administration to say, hey, we're all together on these items. There's going to be, devils in the details again, but it makes Tom's job, I think, and my job a lot easier when the whole industry is together and we're not fighting each other.
Indeed, it does. Well, keep up the good work, and thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Back to you, Colleen.
Yes, what a great conversation. We really appreciate the uniqueness of these two industry associations coming together on the Space Policy Show. And I'm sure our audience does too. So thank you, Audrey, Dave, and Tom for joining. And be sure to check out our other shows in the Going Faster series or any of our previous episodes. The Center's deeper research is also available at csps.aerospace.org, and you can subscribe there or follow us on socials To get instantly notified, you can engage with our guests and our policy experts. And thank you to our audience for your continued support. We are one of the longest running space policy podcasts. Since March 2020, we've got almost 160 episodes spanning topics and speakers from across the sector and from across the world. Aerospace is proud to be unbiased and not-for-profit. Many thanks to James Liggins, our technical director, and thanks to you, our audience. Until next time.